Hello and welcome to the BVP 2019 EII Fund presentation. This is part two of a two-part investor webinar that we've put together. And the first part is on our website and where it talks about a bit more about BVP and a bit more about the scheme itself. So the purpose of this webinar is to talk about the plans for the 2019 fund and to look at some historical performance and to look at some of the companies that we've invested in with some of our previous funds. By way of background, my name is Conor Duggan. I'm the investment director here at BVP, and I'm now going to talk a little bit about BVP and who we are. So BVP was started by Elliot Griffin in 2004, and since 2007, we've raised and managed 12 EII funds, and we're now in the process of raising our 13th EII fund. We have 38 million under management. We have invested in over 30 Irish businesses to date. We've got 500 EII investors. And we manage funds, and a fund basically is a pool of money that's created from investors. So we gather in money from now until the end of the year from individual investors, pool all that money together, and that becomes the fund. And then on January 1st, we start investing the fund, and we invest in between 4 and 5 different companies with the fund. So we take a stake in those companies, and that then makes up the fund. So essentially, your investment is diversified across 4 or 5 different companies in a range of different industries, some of which I'll talk about further in the presentation. So this next slide, I'm just going to talk about communication and our communication channels. So at BVP, we kind of pride ourselves on our ability to and our willingness to communicate with investors. So as soon as an investor invests their money, they get a login to our investor portal, which allows them to access the fund information at any time. They'll also receive fund newsletters, which we distribute, and it will include updates on new investments we've made. We also send out audited accounts, which are prepared by our independent auditor. So that's done in the first quarter of every year, and that's then distributed out to our investors. So that will show the value of each of the underlying companies in each of the funds. We also send out an annual fund report, which goes deeper. So it talks about sort of the year in review and talks about the plans for each of the individual companies within each fund. And we also host an investor conference. So an investor conference is something we host normally in October of every year, where we invite all of our investors to come to meet the team, to hear from the investment team, to hear about updates on some of the portfolio companies, get some ideas about some of the themes we're looking at for upcoming funds, and to meet some of the portfolio companies. So, it gives investors an opportunity to actually press the flesh, if you like, with some of our underlying portfolio companies. And I think from the feedback we've got from previous conferences, it's definitely something that our investors seem to enjoy. So I think this slide just gives a good overview of the type of investments that we've made in the past. So all of these companies are investments we've made with previous funds. And it's just a selection of the companies. There's a lot more companies that we've invested in, but this just kind of, the purpose of this is just to show the breadth of different companies that we've invested in. So if you take Buy Me, for example, we just invested with them this year. So they're a grocery delivery company, and their founder, Devin Hughes, is a very dynamic young CEO, and they've got big plans for 2020, something I'll touch on in a little bit. Green Generation is an anaerobic digestion plant that we invested in a couple of years ago, and they're doing really well. Health Beacon is a company in the medical technology sector. So I'll talk about, actually I have a slide on them further on in the presentation, which I'll speak about. Bleeper Bike is Dublin's first stationless bike sharing company, and we invested in them with our 12th fund. Park BNP is a company we invested in a couple of years ago, and they are like the Airbnb for parking. And they've recently gone to the US, which is great to see. Urban Vault is a company who do lighting as a service. So essentially they install LED lights and do it as a service, so it doesn't have any upfront cost to the customer. I'll talk about them as well in a couple of slides. But I guess the kind of key takeaway from this slide is just to show the kind of the different industries that we invest across. And the benefit of that for our underlying investors is that they get diversification. So we're not overexposed to any one industry. We kind of spread our investments across a number of different industries, which allows our investors to benefit from diversification. And I'll talk a little bit in more detail in the next slide or next couple of slides about the actual investment criteria we use, which I hope you find useful. On this slide, I'm going to talk about the fund performance for some of our previous funds. So you'll see starting in the left-hand column, it's the number of the fund, so 8 through 12, 12 being our most recent fund. And then the year of investment is actually, that's the year the money is invested into the fund, and then the year that the money is invested into the companies. So you'll see 2014/15 means we raised the fund in 2014, but didn't invest until 2015, which is standard. That's how the scheme works. Then the amount invested is just the amount of money that we've raised from investors, and you'll see there's been a big increase in recent years, which is definitely good to see. And then the actual distributions to date. So it's worth mentioning here that all of these funds are still within their minimum 4-year holding period. So we actually haven't made any distributions to date because they're in the 4-year holding period and they've lose relief. And then the column on the far right is kind of the most important one, which shows the book value and tax relief. So book value is the value of the investment that we have in that company. So essentially how much are our shares worth, which is obviously what our investors are concerned with. So if you take the first fund, which is Fund 8, 166%. So what that is, that's 30%. 30% of that is the tax relief that's been received, because that fund would have been working under the old tax system where you got 30% relief in year 1 and then a further 10% in year 4. So they haven't reached their year 4 just yet. So that's why they've only got 30%. So the difference between the 30% and 66 is 36, and that's capital appreciation. So essentially the investments that we've made in that fund are worth 36% more now than they were when we invested. Likewise for the 9th fund, the 42% is 30% tax relief, and then a further 12% capital appreciation. For the 10th fund, we've had a little bit of a capital loss, so that's been offset by the tax relief, which means that the net figure is 100%. For the 11th fund, we haven't, the reason it's 119 and not 130 is because we haven't received tax relief for all of our investments yet. We've been told that they're due to be approved very shortly, which will mean that will bring that up to 130%, but revenue have been backlogged recently with applications, so it's taking a bit longer than expected. And then for the 12th fund, that's the fund that we raised last year. We've got 14% relief because we've invested in companies and some of them have already qualified for relief. They've already spent 30% of the money we've given them, and therefore we've got relief on them. So that's the reason it's 114%. The other thing that's worth pointing out is that the 12th fund hasn't been audited yet. So the values of those investments are still held at the same price as the value that we went in when we invested. So our independent auditors, when they do their audit at the end of this year, they'll apply an independent valuation to them, which we absolutely expect will be higher than it is currently. So just to talk a little bit now on this slide about realization methods. So this becomes relevant after 4 years. So we invest in the company on day 1, then 4 years later, the minimum holding period has expired, and now we're looking to get out. So when I say get out, we're looking to get cash basically for our shares, and we'll then distribute the cash back to investors. So the most common ways of it happening are trade sales, larger buyouts by investors, or company share buybacks. So with the trade sale, that means that essentially the entire company sold. So the company gets acquired by a larger player and they offer a certain value for every share. So essentially everybody gets out and we walk away, and that's a really neat way of doing it. The second option is where a larger investor comes in. So let's say another institutional investor wants to invest in the company that we hold the shares in. And instead of the company issuing new shares, we offer our shares to them. So they basically, let's say they want to take 10% of the company and we own 10% of the company. They just buy our shares directly, and we then take that cash and distribute it back to our investors. And then finally, the other way of getting it is company share buybacks, where the company themselves, they buy back the shares from us. So this is very attractive to promoters, because what we can do when we make investments is we can have a predetermined price. So for argument's sake, if we were talking to a CEO tomorrow, we could say to him, we'll give you the option to buy us back at, let's say, a 1.8 times return after 4 years. So what that means is we give him $1 million, let's say we invest $1 million into the company. And then in 4 years' time, he can buy us back for 1.8 million. So our investors get 80% capital appreciation on top of what they've got in tax relief. And the founder is happy because if his business is worth 3 times the value that it was when we went in, he now can buy our shares and then sell those shares later on at a much higher price. So he gets the benefit. So it's kind of an incentive that we use to kind of encourage founders and CEOs to buy us back after the 4-year period has expired. And it's something that it's kind of a win-win for both, because our investors get a great return, they get their tax relief, and then the founder buys back his shares and he can then sell them in a year's time or 2 years' time for a much higher price. So sort of everyone wins. So in terms of actual distributions, what I've shown here is our distributions to date. So you'll see that after the 4 years have elapsed, we make every effort to get a successful exit. So pre-2018, we've had exits in the amount of 3.82 million. In 2019, we had a number of exits that came to a total value of 1.13 million. And then we expect to have exits of 3.5 million in Q1 of 2021. And that's based on current basically where things stand at the moment. So we don't expect anything to change. So fingers crossed that all that money does get distributed. And then the part on the right there just shows some of the companies that we've had successful exits with in the past. So Credit Carbon is one, EcoFix, EFT, Activation Energy as well. And it's worth noting actually on our first webinar, which is on our website, I kind of go into more detail about Credit Carbon and EFT. So if you get a chance, you might have a look at that first webinar. So in the next section here, I'm going to talk about our investment criteria, and I'm going to kind of illustrate the criteria by talking through a number of different case studies. So in terms of our investment criteria, the first one is EII compliance. So, you know, we're an EIS manager, and so the first barrier that a company needs to get over is that they need to be EII compliant. And that's one of the first things that we look for when we, like literally in the initial conversation we have with the company, is that we establish whether they're going to be compliant, because otherwise there's no point in talking to them. And then throughout the whole due diligence process, we then make extra steps to make sure that they are definitely compliant. So essentially we want to absolutely minimize the risk that they're not compliant. And even though the new scheme now puts the onus on the company to make the declaration and it puts the risk on the company, we still don't want to invest in companies if we don't think that they're definitely EII compliant. And sometimes we actually go as far as to get pre-approval. So we can go to revenue with essentially saying, we want to do this investment, we want to invest this amount, can you give us confirmation or give us essentially pre-approval that they're compliant? So it's something we take really seriously. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that all of these companies are Irish businesses, and we feel really passionate in BVP about supporting Irish businesses and supporting Irish employment. And it's something we really pride ourselves on. And the number of companies we've invested in and the number of companies we're actually in active negotiations with have unbelievable founders and, you know, really great ideas is really something to be proud of. And, you know, I think there's so many businesses that we've looked at and that we've invested in that actually can compete on a global scale. And it's really something, you know, we take very seriously. We love seeing Irish businesses compete in the global scale, because there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be. The second point is just around strong management teams. So when we look at a business, we look in a lot of depth to the management team itself. And what we typically want to see is we want to see people who have expertise in that industry. So if a guy is in healthcare, that he's, you know, he spent years in healthcare and he's an expert in the field. But the other thing is we want to make sure that, you know, there's complementary skills in his team. So there's no point in having a scientist who has nobody else in his team, you know, something about finance, for example, right? So we look for complementary teams. Management teams that have worked together in the past is kind of ideal, but we want to see that they have, you know, skills that offset each other, right? So if one guy can be really good in sales, we want to make sure that they have a really good finance guy to kind of counteract that. So that's kind of the balance that we look for. And the other thing we look for is to make sure that the team is aligned with us. So we want to make sure that these teams need this business to work. Not that they want it to work, they absolutely need it to work. So what we call it all in is the term we use. We basically want, you know, these entrepreneurs to be, this has to work for me and my family, and that's kind of the biggest incentive they have. And that's something that we look for. In terms of the proven track record of success, that that generally applies to, well, it applies to the business in terms of revenue generating, but it also applies to the previous history of these founders. So, you know, if a guy has, or a girl has had a company and they've had a previous exit, that's absolutely reassuring for us. Or if they've excelled in their previous career, again, it's something that we look for. And then on the revenue generating point, like we're willing to invest in businesses that are loss making, but they have to be revenue generating. So essentially, you know, when we look at businesses, we want to know, have you demonstrated basically that this is a product people want? Have you got customers? Are they serious customers? Are they repeat customers? Do you have a credible story as to basically how you're going to increase your sales to then get to profitability? So that's something we put a huge amount of focus and energy on. Another thing is the large market share. So what we really want to see is a big market. So if you've got a massive market, you don't need a huge market share. If you've got a tiny market, you need a massive market share, and market share is something that's quite difficult to get. So we want to invest in businesses that operate in markets that are big. And if we can get businesses that are operating in markets that are big and they're growing as well, that's kind of the holy grail. In terms of the competitive advantage, quite simply, we just want to know why are you going to be successful? Why are you going to be the company that makes it? Why are you going to be the product that people are going to buy? Again, that's another key question we have. The exit opportunities. So when we make an investment, the first thing we look for is how we're going to get out. So almost before we start thinking about how we're going to get in, we start thinking about how we're going to get out. And the things we look at there are, you know, how attractive is this business? Is there a lot of kind of bigger players that will acquire this business once they get larger? Do they have something unique that people want to buy? And then will they have sufficient cash to buy us back? So we spend a huge amount of time on financial due diligence to make sure that, you know, how realistic is it that they'll have the cash or they'll be able to raise enough debt to buy back our shares. And then finally, the critical thing is how big a problem is it that you solve? So we see a lot of guys who come in, or a lot of girls who come in, and you know they have these products, and you think, oh, that's great, but actually it doesn't really solve anyone's problem. It's not a burning problem. So what we really look for is businesses where they solve a critical issue, and that's kind of where they're, you know, if it doesn't solve a critical issue, then we don't invest in the business. So here's a good example of a really strong management team and a really good product. The company is called Tandem HR. We've just closed an investment with them, and that's their CEO and co-founder Aisling in the picture there, winning the Startup of the Year at the Image Business Women of the Year Awards. That was last week, I think. So we were definitely proud that she won that award, and it was definitely well deserved. And Aisling and her partner Claire had spent, I think, 25 years plus in HR. They're both absolute experts in it. And they worked together in a company called Telefonica in Spain. And Aisling was the head of HR for Europe for Telefonica. So they came from a huge background in HR, and they realized that large corporates were having a big issue with employee retention. And what was causing part of the issue with the employee retention was that performance management wasn't good enough. So essentially the old system of the annual review was outdated, and people wanted feedback in real time. They wanted feedback continuously, and they wanted to know they were growing. So they've developed this company which basically offers a solution to that. And they've acquired a number of customers in mainland Europe. They've got some big banks, some big insurance companies, as in some of the biggest in the world, who have 50,000 to 150,000 employees. And they're now in the process in 2020 of just rolling out to those large customers and acquiring other customers of that similar size. And the other thing that's worth pointing out is that there's other investors in here. So that's another thing that we look for when we were looking at potential investments. Are there other institutional investors in here? And in this case, there's Active Frontline. So we work quite closely with them to make sure that we're bringing as much value as we can to Tandem. So that's a kind of another thing that's critically important when we look at investments. This company is a company called UFO-Drive, and that's Aidan McLean holding the prize there from the Best Startup Award at the Global Ventures Summit. That actually happened just a couple of weeks ago as well. So really interesting story with UFO-Drive. The company was founded by Aidan, and the reason it was founded was because he was coming back from a business trip, and he's had a terrible experience with a car rental company. And on his flight home, he came up with a business plan where he imagined what would it look like if he had his ideal car rental company. And what he wanted really high-end cars, really luxury cars that were only electric, and everything could be done through the app. So they would be in really convenient locations. You could do everything through the app. You just drive away, come back and plug it in. And so UFO-Drive is born. They now have 11 locations, as you see in the top right there, in Ireland, UK, Germany, France, Holland, Luxembourg, and Belgium. In Ireland, they actually have a bay in St. Stephen's Green Shopping Centre. So if anyone gets a chance to pop in, it's definitely worth a look. Really impressive outfit. And, you know, again, this kind of ties back to that real problem. You know, when I talked about the investment criteria, this is a real problem. Like everyone probably, you know, can remember a bad experience they had with car rentals. And this is an absolute alternative to that. We can be app only, you know where the car is, there's no, you know, queuing, there's no sales, there's no upselling, none of that. All those problems go away. And he's having huge success, and 2020 is really exciting, where they're looking to get to at least 20 locations. And they're also talking about doing a much larger funding round as well, which we'd be more than willing to go in again. So we'd be more than willing to invest some of our 2019 fund into this company, because they'll be raising more money from big, probably European or US-based investors, which is always good to see. The third company, HealthBeacon. HealthBeacon is a healthcare company founded by Jim Joyce and Kieran Daly. So these, Jim and Kieran, they've had med tech companies before. So, you know, again, go back to their criteria. They've got proven track records in the space, and what they developed was essentially a digital box which allows patients to monitor the medication they're taking. So they realize there's a big issue in medicine at the moment relating to medical non-adherence. So medical non-adherence means basically you're not taking your medicine correctly. So you're either not taking it, you're not taking enough of it, or you're taking too much of it. And so this box allows you to take your medicine correctly. And what that facilitates is that it facilitates a massive increase in the efficacy of drugs, and which is obviously good news for the patient, but it's also good news for the pharmaceutical company as well, because the pharmaceutical company can then prove that actually the efficacy of the drugs is much higher. So we invested in them with our 11th fund, and they've got big plans for 2020. They're going to make, or they have already made a couple of critical hires. So they've hired some really senior salespeople, and they're kind of going after the US market more and into Europe. And again, just to point at the other investors, there was a number of other institutional investors in there when we got in. So, you know, that's something we look for as well, particularly in this kind of space. So we like to see that there's a couple of investors that are kind of med tech specialists, and it's something that we rely on because they have in-depth medical expertise, which is something that we can leverage from. The company UrbanVolt is a company I briefly spoke about earlier. So they're actually Ireland's first certified B Corp, which is something we were very proud of. And B Corp award is awarded, it's verified by an independent body, and it's given to organizations who can verifiably demonstrate that they're making huge efforts in terms of sustainability and accountability, and they're basically getting the mix right between profit and purpose. And fair play to UrbanVolt for getting that award. It was definitely a big milestone. Essentially what UrbanVolt do is they install LED lights into large factories. So they save up to 70 to 80% of energy bills for the customer, which is obviously great news for the environment. But it also means that they can make a business out of it because they take a portion of the savings, and that then pays off the equipment they put in. And it's really attractive for large corporates because they can, number one, reduce their emissions. Number two, they can save money, which is important. But number three, there was some recent accounting changes to how you account for operating leases or capital leases. So essentially it has to be booked as debt, right? So, by using UrbanVolt, this is seen as a service. So essentially it's off balance sheet, so it doesn't affect the liquidity of the business, which is really attractive for some of these large corporates they deal with. Some of them are public companies, so you know they don't want to have too much debt, and it's a really easy solution for them. So UrbanVolt have made it really, really simple for large corporates to roll this out across all of their locations, and recently signed an agreement with a major US trade association who have about 30,000 members in the association, and they're all across the US, some of the biggest companies in the world. And this gives them access to the chief decision makers in these large corporates. And so instead of selling to one site, they're now going to sell to 100 sites at a time. And so revenue is going to really, really jump up as they scale across the US. and they're now in the process of raising another investment round. So they're raising more money for a much larger round so they can scale to the US more aggressively. So keep an eye out in this company in 2020. We definitely have high hopes for them. So just to talk a little bit about target companies for 2019. So the first thing I guess to point out is that we're going to focus on investing in efficiency and sustainability, which are kind of the cornerstones of BVP. And within that, we're going to try and focus on the sustainable development goals. So we're going to invest in essentially things that make the world a better place, whether it's clean energy, reduction in waste, urban mobility. There's so many different things, medical technology, so many different things that we can invest in that essentially are either efficient or they're sustainable and are essentially trying to make the world a better place, as I said. So to get a little bit more specific, we've two targets in the medical technology space. One is a personal diagnostic tool. So this tool is used to kind of help treat irritable bowel syndrome, as well as a number of other kind of digestive conditions. Essentially, it's a device where you breathe into the device, and it reads the hydrogen in your breath, and it then tells you what you should and shouldn't eat. And they have big plans to go to the US and to go to Europe, and also to partner with GPs. So I've spoken to a number of GPs who think this is a really good idea because it removes the kind of it makes it more objective for the doctor to be able to treat it. So it removes the subjectivity which sometimes is associated with IBS. The other medtech company is a cybersecurity company. So they are working with a lot of the large medical equipment manufacturers to increase their cybersecurity, because hospitals are now, really cognizant of the importance of cybersecurity. Some of you may have seen a breach in the NHS a couple of years ago, which caused absolute chaos. And as kind of hospitals become more digitalized, as patient records become more digitalized, it's going to become a bigger and bigger issue. And this is a company that's trying to find ways to basically protect against breaches in cybersecurity. In terms of the marketplace, so the first one there is a company that they're sort of the middleman between customers and event organizers. So the easiest way to describe it is if, say you're booking a train from Dublin to Galway, and you go on to Erin Road Erin's site. Well, you're booking your train ticket, and you'll see a pop-up, or you'll see on the side of the screen, you'll see advertisements for events that are on in Galway. And so this company facilitates that. So they work with both the website, the Erin Road Erin in this example, and the event organizers in Galway. So let's say it was Galway Races, and they work with this intermediary to advertise on different platforms. So it makes it easier for customers to book those events, and it gives a huge, it widens the scope of the views that an event organizer can get. So it essentially makes it much easier for them to market. So definitely excited about that company. The other company is Grocery Delivery, which is the company by me, which I talked about a little bit earlier. So they're raising a larger round of financing to allow them to go to the UK. So we're definitely excited about potentially doing another investment with them. Then in the mobility space, we're talking to a company who do installations of electric vehicle chargers. So they install chargers into commercial units. So they've got a lot of supermarkets and kind of a lot of government bodies that they're already doing installations for. And they're also working with hotels. So hotels see this as a kind of a competitive advantage as more and more people get electric cars. So, if no hotel wants to be behind the curve. So, they know that people are getting more electric cars, and therefore will want to know for sure that the hotel has a charging facility. So that's one of the areas they're focused on. And then they're also building a network. So essentially you'll be able to go in your app and you'll be able to see where all of these charges are across Ireland, which will make it much easier to operate your electric vehicle. And then finally, the digital EV car rental, that's UFO Drive, which I touched on a little bit earlier. So they've got huge plans for 2020, and they're building locations, like literally there's a new location popping up every couple of weeks. And so we're in talks to them about potentially doing another investment round as well, which is another exciting business to be involved with. So just to kind of finish on this slide, just to notice or to point out that the investments we make will be using the investment criteria, which I touched on earlier, and will be with businesses that fit into our kind of cornerstones of efficiency and sustainability, and within those sustainable development goals. I'm just going to talk a little bit here about the recent high-level changes to the legislation. So these are really important changes. So this self-certification change came about from revenue. So previously, companies had to be approved by revenue before you would be allowed to claim relief, whereas now companies can self-certify. So as soon as we make an investment, the company, once they've spent 30% of the money, they can then issue what's called a statement of qualification, and then our investors can claim relief on that. So it really, really quickens up the process, and you can get your tax relief much quicker than you've been able to in the past. The other big change is the type of shares we can invest in. So previously we could only invest in ordinary shares, which meant that we just had a pro rata share of the equity of the business, whereas now we can invest in preference shares. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to get a liquidation preference, and that's really important to protect our investments on the downside. So if everything works out and everything goes to plan and we get a very successful exit, it's not a problem. But in the event that things don't go to plan, it really protects us. So the easiest way to think about it is if we went into let's say we invested $1 million into a business that was worth 10 million, and then 3 years later things didn't work out and the business was sold for 5 million, we would get our $1 million back first. So essentially our capital gets preference over all other shareholders. So it's critically important in the downside scenario that our capital is protected, and therefore our investors don't lose on the capital. The third change is this the 40% relief. So previously you got relief of 30% in year 1 and 10% in year 4, and that's now changed to 40% relief in year 1, which makes a big difference. The final change then is the maximum amount eligible for relief has been increased to 150K for 2019, and then 250,000 for 2020 onwards, which is another welcome change. In terms of the process of application, so at BVP we've tried to digitalize everything, and we have digitalized everything, so you can actually do it all online if you'd like. You can fill out the application form through a website called DocuSign. And for AML, so if you need to do any anti-money laundering, whether you're an existing investor whose ID might have expired, or you're a new investor who's looking to come in, you can do that all through IDPal. So you just take a picture of your ID and your proof of address, and it really, really helps the process. If you would prefer, of course, you can do it in paper. You can send the application form to the address below, or you can, and sorry, that would mean that you would have to get the copies of your ID and your address would have to be certified through copies, which would have to be certified by a guard or an accountant. So if you'd like that, you can just send them to the address below. And then in terms of payments, we take checks and we take bank drafts and we take EFTs, and I can send out the bank details to anyone who's interested after this call. And again, just our address down there is BVP Investments, Unit 23, Cubes 2, Beacon South Quarter, Sandyford, Dublin. And that takes us to the end of the presentation. So thanks a million for listening. And if you have any questions, or you would like any more details about the scheme or BVP or the plans of the 2019 fund, please feel free to give me a call on 01657 2900. You can email hello@bvp.ie, or you can email me directly at Conor, CONOR, @bvp.ie. And please visit our website as well if you'd like, is bvp.ie, and we're on social media as well. So thanks again for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you in the future.